Hey everybody. Hi. Today I'm going to give you a sneak peek into learning Python. The easy way really, because Python is one of the most popular programming languages. And why should you learn Python? Well, Python is programming language which is one of the most common. Or if you go into this particular index called the TOB index, which basically ranks all the programming language, you can clearly see that Python is on the top 5 programming languages in the world. And the Java is the programming language which is number 1. But again, Java is used mostly in large organizations, and C is also used in a large kind of organization. So Java and C, and I'll come to it, and C++ is also used in large organization. Java is mostly used in enterprise level organizations. C is closer to machine, so it's also very difficult language. C is not an easy language, and C++ is used mostly in Windows. C# is also used mostly in Windows. So when you look at the top 4 languages, they are relatively difficult, and they are also what you call is non-static languages, non-dynamic languages. Python is the first language which is a dynamic language, or I have made a video on dynamic languages versus static languages, but essentially what it means is that static languages are more difficult in comparison to dynamic languages. So when you look at dynamic languages, Python is a number 1 in that sense. Now I'll give you a couple of more ratings which will give you a good view of the popularity of each programming language. Now this index is called the PYPL in popularity language, and here if you look at it, Java is number 1 and Python is actually number 2 in terms of market share. So this really tells you that Python is a very popular programming language. And the reason why Python is popular is because Python is used in a lot of areas. So when you talk about machine learning, which is the talk of the day these days, Python is used very extensively in machine learning. You talk about artificial intelligence, which is AI. Python is very extensively used in artificial intelligence, robots and robotics, and so on and so forth. And Python is also used in the web world. So when you're developing a web framework, Django is a very famous framework which people use. Flask is another very common framework which people use. So these are all Python based frameworks, and all in all it is called a general purpose language. And what a general purpose language does is that it gives you access to number of areas. So for example, if you choose a language like PHP or Ruby on Rails, okay, you will be restrained to a web area. Or if you use, let's say, C language, then you will not be, if you use Java or C, then you will not move to web world. You will stay in a different area domain. But Python is the one which sort of sits in all these areas. So it's a very useful language to learn. And most colleges, especially the top colleges like MIT and these educational institutes, teach Python as the first programming language. Now, how do you download Python? So Python is downloaded if you go to the Python website, which is python.org. You go and you can download 2 versions of Python. 2.7 is a slightly older version of Python, and 3.6 is the latest version. So if you click here, it will go and download a file into your into your computer, and then you can open this package and run it. So I have already downloaded it. There's nothing to explain in terms of downloading. Once you download it, you will get IDLE, and you will also get a Python launcher. So a Python IDLE is nothing but a kind of an integrated development shell. It's kind of an environment where you can go and start typing the Python commands, and it will throw outputs of that. And you can also save this into a separate file and then run it within the IDLE. So this is one way of running Python. Another way of running Python in your computer is to use your terminal. So the terminal is this black box, which typically, if you go here in your system's preference, you will see this terminal here, or sometimes you find it in mission control. You find it in system preferences. Somewhere you will be able to find the terminal, which I have kept it in my the launchpad that I have. So this is the terminal. Now terminal directly talks to your computer, so it's much more faster and you don't have to download anything here. So if you have to run small lines of code and see how it works, terminal is very useful. But if you have to run an entire program which is more than one line, then you have to use a IDLE. There is another IDLE which is very famous, which is called PyCharm, and this is a proper IDE, which is an integrated development environment. So you can download this also, but I think for our purpose we should be able to run with terminal and the IDLE that Python provides. This is a very big file, and this is generally used, as it says, for professional development. So I would not recommend you to use it. I just told you because I thought it is an IDE that you should know about. Okay, so let's understand how does Python work. And this is my terminal, and as you can see, it's prompting in my terminal and I'm in my root directory. So root directory, say if I go and type Python and I say enter, it will load Python. Now I'm using a Macintosh computer, which is an Apple computer, and the Macintosh computer comes preloaded with Python. You will not have this option in Windows. So in Windows you have to use an IDLE. You don't have it loaded inside the computer in the system, but in Macintosh luckily we have this loaded within the system. So the terminal becomes a Python terminal now, and once it becomes a Python terminal, you can play around with Python and see how it sort of works. And if you don't have the terminal, then you can use the shell, which will help you write the same thing in Python. So let's type our first Python programming code, and Python is a very easy programming code and language, and it is very easy to understand. It is very easy to read, because most of the things written in Python is written in English. There are the symbols or the operators used here are very English-like, unlike in other languages where you will have special symbols or characters. So let's type the first line, and the first line obviously is always, as they say, is the hello world command. So if I am going to Python and if I am typing print, and in a bracket I will say hello world, and I'll close the vowel and close the bracket, and if I say enter, it will simply give me a hello world character. So it will return a hello world character, and this is what the programming language does when you're in the shell. And the same thing happens here. If I type print, and within that if I say hello world and say enter, I'm sorry, I did not put the quote marks, print hello world, close quote marks, and it will type hello world. So this is how the programming languages work. You type something and it gives you back something, and if it doesn't understand what you're typing, then it will give you a syntax error, which means it did not understand what you said. So you need to know how to communicate to a computer. Like every other thing, you need to know what kind of language does it understand. So if you're dealing with, let's say, a dog, you need to understand the language that the dog understands, and then only you can communicate with it, because they don't speak pure English. they understand symbols. So likewise, computers also don't understand pure English, they understand a form of English. Okay, so that was our first programming experience. Now I want to close the terminal because it will confuse you if I use terminal and the ideally. So I'll close the terminal for a while and start using ideally because that's more understandable. So I'm closing it and I'm terminating. And before you terminate it, I would suggest you quit the program. So either you can quit like this or you can exit like this. It's up to you. Both these commands will do the same thing. And if you don't want to use the commands, you can simply type Ctrl+C and it should exit from here. Sorry, Ctrl+C is used if you're running a server. So you use quit and you're back into your console. So with that, we'll close this, and we have closed the ideally, and we will now open the shell. Now, before we move further, I wanted to give you some view of the Python programming language and how is it different from other language as well. So Python is called as what's known as a dynamically typed language, and what it means is that it's much more easier to write in Python in comparison to a static language. A static language, however, is very explicit. What I mean by that is it tells the user, the third party, let's say I'm typing something and you're watching it. If you're typing something in Python versus a static language, in a static language you'll know exactly what I'm doing, and we will get to understand that as we go forward. Okay, and second thing is Python is based on something called as white space. So white space means that Python does not have any commas or any breakpoints through the semicolons, which is a very common thing in other programming languages. It simply means that if you give a space between one line to another line, it will assume that that's the right way you've sort of understood. So I'll explain that as we go forward, but it sort of helps to understand that that's how the programming language works in Python. Whereas if you have to do something in JavaScript, and here is a JavaScript console that I'm going to open and show you, and you will notice that JavaScript requires you to I'm sorry. Okay, I'm so sorry. So let's say this is the JavaScript console, and I'm going to open up the console here by typing Command, Control and J. Sorry, it's Option, Command and J. And if I type, let's say, the same thing in JavaScript, and I can do the same thing in JavaScript as well because it's also programming language. Here I have to end this by this particular semicolon here. So this is what you see. This semicolon ends the program, and this is a valid JavaScript. So JavaScript will print it. Here, whereas in Python, so the command is console.log hello world. So it will return hello world. So this is a JavaScript typical console thing. Print will also print it, but it will not print it on the console. It will print it in the HTML page where JavaScript is rendering. So what I wanted to show you here is this semicolon, which is a very common thing in JavaScript, but in Python you will not have any semicolons. And that's a good thing because it's quite easy to use this language, and there are it basically depends on the white space that you give between one line and another line. So that's something that you have to remember. So let's start off with a couple of things which you have to know in programming terminology. And one thing is variable. So variable is defined by an assignment operator called equal to. And what it does essentially is that it makes it takes a value and assigns it to another value, and we will come to that later, but I will explain that to you. So let's say you have a very long string, hello, my name is something, and I am going to somewhere, right? Now if I have to print this, assuming I need to go and say print, and I need to then close this, and it will print it. It's great. Now if I ask you to print this again you have to go and type print, hello da 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 da, and type the entire sentence, whatever it is, and then go ahead and print it. Now this is not really intuitive in the sense that it doesn't help you. So if you have to use this particular command or this particular sentence in 10 different places, you will have to go and type it in 10 different places. So what programming languages do is that they take this particular line and assign it to another element called variable. So let's call our variable as spam. So you can call it spam, you could call it A, you could call it B, you could call it anything you want. Okay, whatever is convenient to you, just call it a very small name which is understandable. And in this case, I'm going to call it spam, and put an equal to sign and just assign that particular name there. Okay, so if I have assigned it here, now I don't have to type the entire line. I simply can go and say print spam, and it will return that entire sentence to me. You can assign to spam, you can assign a number, and it will do the same thing which it did to the sentence. And the good thing about variable is that variable doesn't keep all the things that you assign to it. It just keeps the last thing that you assign to it. So let's say you are wanting to, in this particular case, I used spam to call out hello, my name is blah 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 blah, and I use the same spam to assign another number called number 34, and instead of throwing the first digit, the first thing, it gave me the second, because it threw this out, it threw the hello word, hello, my name is so and so string, and it put this particular integer into it. So that's what variable does, and variable is one of the most important concepts in programming language. Now, as you would have noticed that I said variable calling a string versus an integer, and this is another concept that you should understand in programming. So let's say that you are going to be using this variable for a cause. So you want to use this variable to concatenate or to join two things. So if you have to do that, then you need to have the variable assigned to the same type. Now you cannot have a variable which is assigned to a different type, add to a variable which is typed to another type. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain that to you probably in a little more detail. So here I'm going to use something called as a string. Okay, so a string is nothing but a string of sentence. So this, if you type anything here, it becomes a string. So string is always put in quotes. So you could use a single quote or you could use a double quote. It doesn't matter. But a string always will return another string. So a string in very simple language is, if you want to write English, it's called string. So if I want to write something in English that would be string, because the computer doesn't go and manipulate anything, and we'll come to that later, because string in itself doesn't do anything. So, your name Sandeep, let's say my name is Sandeep, it will not do anything with my name, okay? It will just return my name. But let's say my name is integer, so let's say my name is integer, it will return, if I wanted to add it, I can do it. So Sandeep plus 56 will give me a syntax error, but Sandeep plus 54 will give me a value. Now you can concatenate string with another string though. So if I want to concatenate it, you can concatenate it with another string, and it should give me let me give some space here, because it doesn't understand space and all of that concept. It will give me my name added like this with a space. So in this particular case, string and string can be added, but integer can be added, but integer and string cannot be added. This is a very important concept in Python. So let me show you JavaScript now, and I keep going back to JavaScript because JavaScript is a weakly typed language. So in my Mac, I'm going to press Option Command and J, which will open a console. So here, let's say I have a variable which I'm going to call S, and I'm going to give it a value of Sandeep. And then I've got a variable called Y, where I'm going to give it a value of and so in the first case I gave it a value of Sandeep, in the second case I gave it a value of 43. Now this is an integer and this is a string. Now see what happens. What does JavaScript do if I just type this? It simply takes both and add it. So it adds Sandeep and it adds 43, and it gives me this value, because it just says that you told me to do this, I'm doing it. Okay. But in Python, it doesn't allow you, and this is a good thing because it sort of restricts the user from doing something wrong. In JavaScript, if you don't understand this particular concept, you will go ahead and concatenate a string and an integer, and you will not even realize that you made a mistake. Okay, because in some future calculations, you might want to deprecate or decrease the value from Sandeep, and you can't do, because string will return it as a string only. So that's what JavaScript does. Anyway, coming back to Python, we notice that Python programming language will add two strings and give you a string back. Now I want to show the same thing with a number. So you can play around with numbers. You can add different types of numbers. And so there are two things that we discussed about. One is variable and second is integer, which is a number. And a variable will always be assigned to one of these things, because it sort of eventually returns the same character that you have assigned it to. So this was a quick view of variables and integers and numbers. So Python also has the same number categories also displayed in points, and this is called a float. Now this plus this will give you a float. So Python will take one integer and one float and return a float. So float is nothing but something which has some points, and this is different in Python. Integers and floats are two different categories, so it treats them very differently. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're dividing 2 by 3. 3 by 2, you get 1.5. And let's say 3 by 3. If it was Python 2, it would have returned integer if I divided 3 by 2. But in case of Python 3, that's not a problem. But what I'm trying to say is that float is a different category, and you need to understand that particular part in the programming languages. So what we have learned so far is that Python is a very popular programming language. We have also learned how does variable work. We have also understood what are the three types of variable. So you have float, you have a number which is called an integer, and you've got a string. And you also have other types of math operators, if you may, called true and false, and that's it. So you will be able to do everything with these 5 types basically. There are other things, but I will not get into that. But primarily with a float, a number is generally called an integer here. You should be able to do all your work in Python. So that's what Python programming language does. And I want you to see some kind of a program in Python, because that will keep your interest on. So first thing first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new file, and I'm going to run all of that in that file. So whenever we run it, we'll see that action happening. So let's say Python has this concept of capturing inputs from the users. So let's say I'm typing input, okay, and within the input I'm saying what is your name. And if I run this program, so let's run this program in the shell and see what happens. So if I run this program, it basically gives me a prompt where I can type something. Okay, so this is kind of a prompt here in Python. I'm using the word prompt because I'm probably sort of comparing it with JavaScript, which does the same thing with a prompt. So in Python you use inputs, whereas in JavaScript you use something called as prompt. So if I go back to JavaScript and I type prompt and I say the same thing, what is your name? You see it will open up here, and you have to give an input here, and it will give the input out here. So that's JavaScript, and this is Python. So let's write a program, okay, and I'm going to open the file, and I'm going to say input brackets, what is your name? Close the bracket, and whatever input you are going to capture, I am going to simply display that as a print value. So what you can do is you can take this input and put it into a variable. So let's say the variable is called name, okay, and I'll assign that input that you're going to give into this name. Now below that I'm going to type print, and I'll say name. So what it will do is it will take this input and it will simply display that name here. So let's just run this program. So we'll say run module, which is I go to this run and I say run module. It will have to save the program, so you just save it somewhere. I'm sorry. So Python is very particular about the indenting. So the moment I indented it inside, it meant that there was something inside the program. But print is a line in itself. So now if I'm going to run it, it should run. So I saved it and it ran here. And when I say, let's say Sandeep, it returns Sandeep because that's what I told it to print. So that's a very simple way of showing a program run. You type something, you give it an input, and it gives you a value which it will run. So that is how a program is run. Now I want to do another series on this one where I'll talk about if statements and operators like and or, but I will not get into those details right now. So I want to understand 2-3 things that we've covered today. So we have covered installing of Python. We have understood how does the print keyword work. We have understood how the variable operates. We have understood the different types: number, float, math. As number, float, number is also called integer. So number, float, string, true and false. True and false is called Boolean. So that only returns 2 values, yes or no, in this case true and false. And we have also tried to use our hands on the program by typing the input command, which basically threw a return value in this program. So this is a quick review of Python programming language. I would highly recommend you start learning this language, because this language has multiple uses across multiple forums, and it's a very easy language and it's a pleasure to write in this language. So thanks very much and see you in series 2.